You know, every year on the last Sunday of Epiphany, while every other parish in the diocese and the church is observing the last Sunday of Epiphany, we're observing the Pasch Parade. And so very few of us get to hear the lessons that are appointed for that Sunday. And they're very, very important lessons indeed, because it's the story of the Transfiguration. Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, where he's revealed as the Son of God. His entire being is transformed and just glistens with the glory of God, because he is the Son of God. And appearing on the mount with him are Moses and Elijah. And it's a highly symbolic moment. It's a moment that is full of meaning for the Jews. And of course, Peter, who's there as well, just can't help himself and asks if he shouldn't build some shelters for Moses and Elijah and Jesus. And why an apparition needs a shelter, I don't know. And the thought is maybe Peter was just being hospitable. But to us, he looks foolish. Well, Moses and Elijah, though, don't. Moses and Elijah represent a reality for the Jews that is unbelievably dense. That Moses is the lawgiver. And seeing him there with Jesus implies Jesus is the new Moses. From Moses we receive the Ten Commandments. And we see that in our first lesson from the 20th chapter of Exodus this morning. But Elijah is something else. Elijah is the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. And one of the most powerful prophecies of the Old Testament is that when we see Elijah, Messiah is close at hand. And so the implication is, well, here's Elijah. So that must mean Jesus is the Messiah. Well, let's back up again and look at at Moses and what's happening in the chapter 20 of Exodus, because this is you got to look at this before you can figure out what's going on in the Gospel of John. Like I said last week, the Old Testament is the foundation. And when you get that, the New Testament becomes much clearer. In the 20th chapter of Exodus, God is giving to Moses the Ten Commandments. And it begins, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And here's the first thing he says to him. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything. Now, if that wasn't enough, over in verse 23, he basically says it again. Do not make any gods to be alongside of me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. Well, you remember Charlton Heston and what happened when Moses was up there too long. They got bored. The Jews got bored and they decided that, well, MTV wasn't on that week, so they were going to have to do something else, and they were going to have to make themselves another god. Now, look, you gotta, one of the things that's difficult to understand about why this is so poignant is when Moses leads God's chosen people out of slavery in Egypt, they're all polytheists. They all bring their household gods. They have all sorts of gods. And it's in the Exodus, in the wilderness, that they are transformed into monotheists, worshiping one God. You shall have no other gods before me. And here's one of the tests. Here's one of the tests. The people get bored, and so they make themselves a calf, a golden calf, an idol. And they're just having a great old time having a party with the idol, while Moses is up on the mount talking to God, because God has got chapter after chapter after chapter of instructions. So we go through chapter 20 and 12 more chapters before Moses comes down from the mount with the tablets. And when he sees that the Jews are having a party and worshiping other gods, he's so furious he breaks the tablets and throws it at them. Then he takes the golden calf and breaks that and grinds it into dust. He's really, really upset. And spiritually, what we see here is that idol worship is a temptation for every generation. The temptation is always to put something before God. And what God himself is telling us is he's a jealous God. He doesn't want you to worship anything else but him. And if you do, it's going to make him really, really angry. Now we can turn to John. 14 centuries later, you'd think, okay, the Jews have had 14 centuries to practice this, and they've got it all straight, right? And it says, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And you might think, well, he's just being a nice guy. No, every Jewish male who lived within 15 miles of Jerusalem was required to go up to Jerusalem. And being a good adult Jew, Jesus did too. He went up to Jerusalem for the Passover. Now it's estimated that the population of Jerusalem would swell by 50 to 180,000 at Passover each year, but there are those commentators who think that it may have gone as high as 2.5 million people. Now think about that for a minute. Pilgrims would walk from as far away as Persia and Syria, from Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And if you want to compare it to something like we all think of the Pasch Parade again. And instead of 40 or 80,000 people coming, think about 5 to 6 times that many people. And instead of being in the Pasch for one day, imagine they're here for 8. Well, that's a lot of people to feed. That's a lot of people to house. And all of those people have come up to the temple for the Passover to offer a sacrifice. They've each got to buy a sacrificial animal for their family. And, oh yeah, when you go to the temple, you have to pay the temple tax. So you're paying for food, you're paying for shelter, you're paying for a sacrifice, you're paying your temple tax, and, oh yeah, you can't pay the temple tax in anything except shekels. So that if you're from another place using other kinds of money, you have to do an exchange. And there's a fee for that too.